Okay. All right. Looks like we're recording. And I'll do a few seconds of silence and then I'll roll the intro. The latest with C Sharp with Jared Parsons. Welcome to the show. I'm Jeffrey Palermo, your host for helping you and your teams move fast and deliver quality and to run your software with confidence in Azure, all while using everything that the .NET ecosystem has to offer. My returning guest on the show, back from episode 287, among others, is Jared Parsons. He is a developer manager for the .NET Tools team at Microsoft, and he's also done extensive work on the C# compiler team. Pretty much everybody tuning in probably uses his code on a day-to-day basis. Jared started out at Microsoft over 20 years ago as a developer. He moved on to become a senior developer, then principal developer, and most recently a principal developer on the C# compiler team before moving to be a developer manager for .NET Tools. He's spoken at many conferences like Microsoft Build and others, and I'm really excited to have him back on the show. So, Jared, how are you, sir?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me back.
Oh, my pleasure, my pleasure. I want to catch up with you because a lot's happened for you on your promotion on different team and whatnot. But before I go there, I always like to ask, because there's new listeners who haven't listened to your previous episodes. You've been a developer for several decades now. You've been at Microsoft over 20 years. What is it about just programming in general that just keeps it fun, where you're saying, man, I love this career. I do not need a career change.
It is just like every day is a new adventure, especially like working on like tooling teams. We are always having to evolve to whatever is kind of going on in the overall ecosystem. Like in the last year, as you can imagine, we've done a lot of work with like AI. Like how can we
Mm-hmm.
incorporate AI into our processes and how we code and how we develop? And that was a huge learning curve of like, okay, how do I like spin up a language model? How can we use like let's go play with CCA and see CCA, like the GitHub Copilot experience. Like we did a lot
Mm-hmm.
of experiments with like what are its limits? What can how we have a giant code base in the C sharp compiler, many, many millions of lines of code. What will it do if we just throw the GitHub Copilot at it? And it turns into just lots of like learnings all the time. There's always something new to play with, there's always something new to do, and there's always a new puzzle. I like puzzles. And it's just like a new puzzle every day. And particularly being on the tooling team, we have kind of those forcing functions on like where is the ecosystem going? Because we have to make sure that we can change our tooling stack to support all the new things going around in our ecosystem and competitive pressures from other ecosystems. And also just
Yeah.
internally, we work at Microsoft. If people have problems in their .NET project, guess who they call? They call the .NET
Right.
team, and that gives us this like daily view into like how our customers do code. Just like recently I got tasked with like, hey, let's look at kind of how build perf works in a few areas. it I went in a deep dive and I was like spelunking through someone's code just like last night on like how are they structuring their builds, how are they structuring their restores, and what could we do to like maybe help them with some of that. And so it's just every day is a new adventure, and there's definitely times where I can feel overwhelmed with all of the work that I have, but I very rarely feel bored. But there's always
Yeah.
something interesting to look at.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned variety and a new every day's a new adventure. I was reflecting just after this latest, after Ignite and .NET Conf with the release of .NET 10 and all the stats, and seeing that it sure looked to me like C Sharp and .NET now are like literally the fastest programming platform on the planet, minus the scientific, projects
Yeah.
where you might do something in a lab. But as far as what you can actually build software with, it looks like .NET's the king of the hill. Do y'all talk about it like that inside Microsoft this year?
I think we like every now and then we'll, celebrate that like we've had some wins. Every year you have that fantastic
Mm-hmm.
browser killing blog post by Stephen Tobe, and that celebrates like all the work we have done. But most of the time, we always just it's a constant like, how can we make it better? Like, what can we do to like push the envelope even further? And this comes to me a lot because working on and running the C sharp compiler for a number of years, it's how can we evolve the language to pair it with work in the .NET runtime so that we can make things faster and faster, like we've done ref fields. We've done like U8 string literals was one that came out recently. Just little small things we can do. We've been recently talking about how we can take all of the lifetime rules today we have around ref safety, and can we take them further so that we can fix a lot of like issues they are seeing kind of in lower parts of the runtime. Particularly, one of the big focuses we have today is there are still parts of the .NET runtime where you have to use unsafe code for perf because
Mm-hmm.
it can eliminate some bounds checks. And we've been talking a lot about all the ref safety work we've done for years, starting with like span of T and all the way to the ref fields. What that really was is an exercise in taking code that can only be performant and if you use pointers, and how can we uplift this
Mm.
into safe code that doesn't have pointers, that has all the kind of bounds checking and niceties that you would expect, and up level that code. And so we've been recently doing another exercise where we've identified a number of patterns, and we're like, how can we up level that while maintaining the perf that we have today?
Yeah, that's a good point. You've been You've been on the show now several times, and we've talked about how the C Sharp compiler team does DevOps. That was back in episode 53, and then also how to actually do testing on the C Sharp
Yeah.
compiler back in episode 287. And the compiler and the language team have kind of had some changes this year, and then you had a promotion and some changes. Can you catch us up on how structured now and how your work is different this fall?
So in terms of DevOps, the one thing that we've really changed in the last year is we've been constantly struggle with the scale that we have to do our work in. Because what I found with like DevOps is you find a solution, it works well for a time, but if it works well, you just keep building and building and writing more code. And eventually you hit some tipping point where it's like, okay, that doesn't work anymore. And
Mm-hmm.
in the last year, we've had a lot of cases where we've had to take in deep looks at how long does it take our PR times to run. And that has caused us to, I did an exercise last year in reshuffling how we scheduled tests in our runners because we found out our scheduling had gotten inefficient again. And so we did a lot of work to reschedule it. But we also just did a lot of work recently in terms of taking like a deeper look into what do we really need to run in a PR, and what could we run like kind of post merge. And because we found that, for instance, the IDE team, the Visual Studio side of C Sharp, they were complaining that some of the compiler tests that we had necessarily took about 2.5, about 2-ish hours to run. And they're like, do we really need to run that on every PR, Jared? And it's like, or can we move this from PR time to post merge time? Is this, and those are actually very practical conversations to have, because we had a lot of tests where it's like, when this test fails, 100% there's a bug and it's 100% a bad problem, but it takes about 2 hours to run.
Right.
This test fails 6 times a year. And that's when we took deep
Okay.
dives and we're like, okay, this is a super valuable test. This was one basically ensuring the compiler remains deterministic.
Mm-hmm.
Same inputs equals same outputs. That test takes a lot of time to run. When it fails, 100% bug. And the problem is if you don't catch that bug early, if you don't catch it at the moment the bug introduces the compiler that breaks determinism, it can take weeks to figure out where the bug is. And so it was very important for us to know what change introduced the bug. But when we really inspected it, we said, but do we need to block a PR on that? If it fails in post merge, and if we don't even notice it for 3 days, we still know what change broke it. And we can go
Ah,
back, we can do the
yeah.
work, and we can fix it. And that turned into a lot of like just really good practical conversations in the team of what do we need to do at PR time? What can we delay to post merge time? And how can we use that to optimize our DevOps workflow?
That's a good point because there's ideally you'd say, I want all of my tests to run before I even look at a pull request. But certain systems that keeping that in the critical path can mean you have a slow critical path.
Yeah. And there are some tests where there's no matter how we look at it, it's like we can't really make that run faster. Like in order to do determinism, for instance, like we have to build the code 3 times because we have to build
Yeah.
it to measure the inputs. And even if you like do the work to parallelize that, like it still becomes, it doesn't really you can't make it that run in 30 minutes for the scale of what we need to do. And when we really kind of stepped back and looked at it, it's a ring validation system. And we already have a ring validation system in the C Sharp compiler. We have what we check and PRs, what we check and merge. Every day, whenever we merge into Visual Studio, we use the latest C# compiler to rebuild all of Visual Studio. So we do that half dozen
Mm,
times a day. We rebuild Visual Studio with the code we checked in the main. And so we already had this like ring validation system, and we just kind of like internalized that, talked about it. And we're like, actually, we could look at PRs and post merge as just another ring system, and what makes sense to do post merge and what makes sense to do in PR, and where's the balance to keep devs productive but not sacrifice quality. And it resulted in a lot of really cool changes. So
nice, nice. Well, the C# team kind of reorganized, and that's been announced, and you've got a promotion. So what's the state of the C# team now, and what is your new role and focus?
uh, so I for a long time I was the compiler lead and I had a number of teams. Now Phil Allen has taken over the C# compiler team. He reports to me, and so Phil Allen now he owns kind of the entire C# experience. And so he owns the compiler, the IDE, and that everything in between. So I have him as one of the leads that reports to me. I also have Mark, who owns kind of the .NET SDK. So all of the, whenever you type .NET build, .NET whatever, that SDK team comes through me. We also have the Razor compiler team is another section. And I also have, that's another lead. And then I also have kind of the dev kit extension in VS Code. The dev kit extension in VS Code is actually a number of different components. So you have a lot of bits from Rosyln, you have bits from Test Explorer, you have bits from the project system. So, but a good chunk of that, not everything falls under me, but a good chunk of the C# dev kit experience ends up falling under me through Jake, who reports to me now.
Awesome, awesome. Lots of changes. So, um, big picture and strategy. What are the longer term thinking? Like the what if? How do we want to steer the ship type of questions that are occupying your brain at the moment?
Oh, there's so many. So there's always like, what are we doing in the C# language? How are we going to keep pushing the envelope in that and tie it to runtimes? And so like one of the big things we're doing right now is looking at finally getting discriminated unions into the language. And so that's a big thing that we've been thinking about for a number of years now. And it's something that we're really kind of putting pen to paper on for C# 15 and .NET 11. But the other kind of big things I think about a lot now is like, how do we kind of what is our dev kit strategy? Like, how are we making like the C# experience work in VS Code? That is something where we've had a lot of success in getting the VS Code experience up leveled and really improving the C# work there. But we've hit a bit of an inflection point in that work. It originally started as taking a bunch of components from different teams, throwing them together, putting in dev and shipping it. But now we're having to sit back and think about like, hey, we shipped a bunch of things together, but now how can we think about them like in terms of principal designs? Like we have all these components that they don't display errors to the customers in consistent ways. They don't like the way that we get people to report bugs is, we're really shipping our org chart when we start asking people for bug reports. Like how
Yeah.
do we get this into a more productized, like single vision thing that we can just kind of up level the experience for customers, get our bug reporting to be better? And bug reporting is something I think an immense amount. Actually, that was one I forgot to mention, the like DevOps side of things. One investment we made, one thing we did in the compiler team for long. A lot of compiler work is bug reports. People send you
Yeah.
bug reports and they're like, hey, the compiler crashes. The compiler doesn't do what I want to do. And one thing we found about a year ago was we were spending an immense amount of time with what I would consider like the best type of customer. Customers who are like, I have a problem. I will give you literally anything you want for you to help me solve that problem. You want the source
Mhm.
code? I'll give you the source code. You want access to this? I'll give you access to this. Please help me solve my problem. But we were spending an immense amount of time working with those customers to get to a point where we could reproduce their bugs.
Mhm.
Because you can imagine, like a lot of times with a compiler, like take like a compiler crash. The compiler's crashing, and we'd be like, that's great. Like, can you share out your code to us, please? And the customer be like, sure. My solution has 1,000 projects in it.
Right. Yep.
Or they'd be like, oh, it's 10 projects. And you're like, oh, you're reading the email. It's like, it's 10 projects. Like, okay, this is not so bad. And they're like, but it requires like 3 authenticated NuGet feeds. And you're like, oh, like, what do we do
Mhm.
now? And
Yeah.
so and you could see like I'd look through these emails, these long back and forth we're having with these customers. We're wasting our time and we're wasting customers' time on like, how can we get you to a point? Like, why are we spending so much time on this? So we stepped back about a year ago and decided to kind of have a motto where if you can reproduce your compiler bug on the command line, like if you can run .NET build or build and the bug reproduces,
Mm-hmm.
we can reproduce your bug and we don't need any help from you.
Yeah.
And so we wrote a tool that essentially can run when you build it. You can change .NET build to produce these things called binary logs, and they have very detailed information about what did the build do. And so we wrote a tool that will go through those log files, find all the C# compiler indications, then we'll find all the inputs to the compiler, we'll find all the things that went into it. We put it in a fancy zip file, send it back, and then locally we can just unpack it and run your repo locally. And it's really transformed from this time where we were taking like multi-day conversations with customers and sometimes multi-week conversation with customers. We're asking them like really awkward questions, like, can you get you customer who probably don't know a lot about how compilers work, could you get us a minimal repro for that bug, please? Take your,
Mm-hmm.
and it's like they're not fun conversations for the customer, not fun conversations from us. And now we just tell them, hey, just run this tool and send us the file that you've got. And it's gone to the point now with customers like the email where, hey, I have a problem, to us having the exception on our machine is minutes, because we give
Wow.
them this tool and we're like, just get this compile. It's called compiler logs. We're like, just give us a compiler log. And even now, the way we triage feedback and like VS feedback and other things is we went from these like really awkward, like, okay, can you try to do this? Can you try to do this? We have a cut and paste response now of like, can you just do this and send us this log and we will be able to take it from there. And it's really transformed how we interact with customers, and it's really cut the amount of time we talk to them, the amount of time they talk to us, and we've been able to turn that into really snappy bug fixes. And it's been very beneficial to us.
Nice. Nice. That architecturally, that I'm trying to put this into a bucket in my brain, and you've got that your software is running on a different environment you control. It's your customer's engineer's workstation. So it's your software is running on a different computer that you don't own, and it's doing something weird over there. And it's sufficiently difficult to recreate enough of that environment on your computer to get the same exception. And so you created some custom telemetry that can be collected on that computer that then will tell you how your software is behaving in their environment. And so you're a compiler, and it may be tempting to think, oh, well, that's some super special thing. But I think so many people have the same problem where, okay, works on my box, everything's good, but it's running on some other environment somewhere, and over there, it's having some problem. And it's the same mindset. It's, okay, we have to figure out some way to collect some telemetry so that we clearly understand what it's doing on that other environment so we can narrow it down.
Yeah. And for us, a lot of it's just like we just need to see the inputs to the compiler, and we can see them locally and we can do it. And getting the inputs and unpacking them on a different, sometimes our customers are having bugs on Linux and most of the dev team runs on Windows. So unpacking them with changes to the file system and changes to the environment can be tricky, but it's been wildly successful for us. It's actually gotten to the point the bugs that don't reproduce with compiler logs have kind of entered like legendary status of like, how did that not, when they don't reproduce, we immediately go into like what happened. And like, want to give you an example of one of the more infamous ones where we had a customer that we had a relationship already with in Discord, and like, hey, I have this bug. I'm like, great, send us a compiler log. So they sent it to us, and then we couldn't reproduce the bug. And it was a very specific type of corruption. And we were like, this is not complicated. Like
Mm-hmm.
the solution this customer has is actually really, really simple. Why can we not reproduce it? And then I couldn't reproduce it, but then one of the guys who reported to me, he was like, oh, I can reproduce the bug. I'm like, okay, what's different about your machine? And then 5 minutes later, he's like, it doesn't reproduce for me anymore. And what it turned out was, at the end of the day, what we found out was there was a bug in part of the Razor compiler where it would corrupt the data structure if the exact length of the generated file was a multiple, I believe, of 2048. One of the
Okay.
things that goes into that file is the path to the Razor file on your disk. And I had a different linked username than the
Yeah.
person who filed the bug, so I no longer did it. But Fred on my team had a username that was matched up perfectly, and his source control matched up perfectly that he ended up hitting the same bug. But that was one where it was just we ended up scratching our head over that one for like a day until we figured out it's like, oh, actually, it turns out the that particular corruption required an exact length file that was very relevant to what was on disk. That one was fun.
Yeah. Fun in the sarcastic way. Nice.
When you get to the end of them, it becomes very, I mean, it's challenging in the middle, but afterwards we end up having a pretty good laugh about
Yeah.
like what led us there.
Right. And then it's like, okay, well, let's gather a little bit more telemetry in our log output tool and let's get their path, let's get their username, and then yeah,
Yeah. Yeah, the
nice.
compiler team can be very detail oriented, so a lot of these turn into like how can you make the tool how can we like make the tool even better and like avoid even these like and a data corruption bug in the compiler is a very non-typical bug and that was a very non-typical bug, but it's still like how can we make it better so we can catch it next time faster.
Right. Right. Well, we are, let's see, what are we, 7 months from the 2025 build conference when Visual Studio kind of embedded GitHub Copilot, and that whole season started with GA, and everyone, okay, Microsoft says, go use it, and everybody's sharing stories. On the compiler team and in the .NET Tools area where you work, how is your organization putting Copilot to work in a way that it's not just, oh, let's see if it can do this, but wow, it can do this. Let's keep doing it.
So we had a couple of different, I would say, iterations of this. And this is one thing I say with I think is very true of AI is what didn't work a few months ago might work tomorrow, might work today. And we tend to be very eager adopters of technology. And so when new
Yeah.
things come out, we're always like, what can we do? And when the kind of GitHub Copilot integration came out, like we had a number of people on my team were super eager, like how can we do this? And we tried it, and I'll just say originally it didn't work so well. Like we have a very large code base, complicated to set up, and we tried it, and we could get it to do a few things in the browser, but we weren't making it was not quite like getting what we wanted out of it. We were having a lot more success doing it locally on our dev boxes. A few months ago, about probably I guess 3 months ago now, uh, actually 2 months ago now, we started doing another test of like, hey, what are the capabilities now? And what we found was it was dramatically better. It was I did an experiment. I'm like, oh, let's just go take a few bugs where I kind of know what the answer is to the bug. I know what the fix is going to be. We assigned it and then just watched it go to town on it.
Now, when you say assign it, are you talking about github.com, the coding agent?
Yeah, we just
Okay.
assign the coding agent. Yeah, this is all talking about in the browser with the coding agent. We're assigning the Copilot entity to the bugs in our repo, and it just started like tearing through a lot of these things. Now, I'll say it's still at the point where it can do still like 90-ish% of the work,
Mm-hmm.
but that is an amazing amount of work for us. And I kind of turned into a challenge for my broader team. Now that I'm a manager of managers, I kind of turned a team of like, hey, just like let's see what you can do. And I think we went from when we sent that challenge out, we had a pretty low Copilot like PR rate at that time, but I kind of challenged the team a few months ago, like I want to see what you guys can do with it. Go try. And within I think 2 weeks, we had about 150 Copilot PRs between all of the teams that I own, and our merge success rate was about 50%. Our kind of abandon rate was about like 30% at the time. Our merge rate was about 50, and then we had about 20 that were still under active development. And what was really great was it took basically no new knowledge work from my team. Like I joke with people, it's like, yeah, 6 months ago it wasn't doing as well, but now it's doing fantastic. I haven't gotten that much better at prompting.
Yeah.
Like
Right.
I still think I have like the same prompt skill level, but the technology has caught up with my inability to coerce it correctly. And what
Right.
was great to see was it was true for everyone on the team. Like even people who I would say would tend to be a little more skeptical about what it can and can't do were suddenly coming back to me like, okay, yeah, no, this is actually like it's super valuable. It's like making a lot of like time change. In particular, It is fantastic at writing tests, and we write a lot of tests in the compiler team. And it is really good because our tests can be very patternistic. They're verbose. We have a lot of them. It can recognize those patterns and write those tests like super fast.
Nice.
One of the more interesting things is we've started using the Copilot in GitHub .com so much is we've started having etiquette conversations in the team because we quickly found out that if someone starts, if you were to start a PR with Copilot and assign it, and I can write to the repo, I can go up to that PR and say at Copilot, hey, can you do this? Can you do that?
Right.
And when we first started this, people normally they would basically, I'd write a PR, and instead of saying, hey, Jared, you should write tests to cover these scenarios, they just went at Copilot, write tests to cover these scenarios.
Right.
And it would happily go on. But we started having etiquette questions. We're like, is that appropriate? Because you just modified my PR, like without asking me. It's like in pull requests in GitHub, if two people can have write access, you can push to people's PRs.
Yeah.
But that's considered a little rude, like to
Yeah.
just go
There's
on
a
like push.
PR owner.
Yeah. And it's like we consider that rude. We really only use that capability in like in special circumstances, like unblocking the build or something like that. Uh, it's like, but now when you go at Copilot on my PR, that might be a little rude.
Yeah.
You might be doing something I did not want you to do. And so we started having these etiquette questions in our chats of like, so is it appropriate to at Copilot? Like, how should we handle this? And we eventually kind of settled onto this situation of like basically write your prompt of what you think it should do, just don't put at Copilot. And if the
Yeah.
dev agrees with you, then they can just say, hey, at Copilot, you can literally just tell at Copilot, like read the comment above me and follow that prompt, and it will go and like do the work for you. And so that
Yeah.
was really kind of funny. I thought it was really amusing to see like that we got to that point where of questions of etiquette.
Well, that's a good point. And of course, the courts talk about with auto driving cars, if something goes wrong and property gets damaged or somebody gets hurt, who's liable? Well, it's the person who's operating the machine. That's the way it always has been. These are machines. Who's the operator? Because the
Yes.
operator is always the person who's making decisions and the person of accountability. So and I think you said CCA. Is that the internal acronym now for
It's
the
like the
GitHub coding agent?
something coding agent.
Copilot coding agent?
Yeah, Copilot coding agent. I think that's the short way that we say it's the Copilot coding
Yeah.
agent. I get.
We
So
have
that's the
term
one.
collision now.
Yeah, that's the one on like GitHub.com. I believe that's the Copilot coding agent. Yeah, there's a lot of term collision. Um, I have one of the things Microsoft. We love our initialisms. We just
Yeah.
love them.
Acronyms.
I have a markdown file that I keep, which is called my jargon translator. It's like, okay, I'm dealing with this team. This is their series of jargon. This is our series of jargon, and there are hilarious conflicts occasionally.
Yeah. Parsons jargons. That'd be good one. So you're running on the hosted version on github.com. How have you settled into what to delegate to that version versus perhaps assigning it locally on your own box?
I think it just comes down to it's hard. Like it's an ever-changing thing. Like what can it do locally and what can it not do? And a lot of times, more recently, I've been trying to do more through GitHub.com just because it's in my current role as like a manager of managers. I joke with people. It's like I have these little 15-minute increments where I can do something. I have free
Mm-hmm.
time in between meetings. And for me, it's much more conductive to just basically do everything in the browser instead of having to like make sure my dev setup is my laptop good enough to handle this bug?
Yeah.
Okay, and maybe I need to like go to a dev box or I need to go find a desktop somewhere to do this. Like I don't necessarily have that time. And code spaces are great for some of the repos I work in, but they're not great for others. And so whenever I was playing around in the C# compiler code base, a lot of times I'm like, I'm just going to start this work in GitHub.com with a Copilot coding agent. And then the real benefit to that is it gets started on the work. I can kind of assign it, look at some bugs, spend 5 minutes on a prompt. I can let it go to town. Then later in the evening, I come back and I'm like, how far did it get? And the advantage is if it's really close, sometimes I can just send it little corrections in the browser and it's done. Other times it's a little bit further away, but then you know what I can do? I just check out the PR locally and I start editing the code there and I can use my local agent to do some of the tasks. When I'm doing more dedicated dev time, these much rarer these days, but when I have like a couple hours, I will often just use the local agent because I'm more in a local workflow and I want to see the changes quicker and be able to edit with the agent, just kind of in a much tighter loop. And so I'll tend to use the
Hmm.
local agents in those cases.
Yeah.
And also there are times where I'm want to play with various MCP servers that people have produced. That's much easier to do if you're working in kind of a local environment.
Yeah. When running locally and you're responsible for selecting the model, is there one that you tend to go with and people on your team tend to go with, or is it a variety?
I think it's a variety. I found most of the questions I ask them all, they work for a lot of the different models.
Yeah.
I more experiment with different models when I'm getting like pushed. Like sometimes I will get pressure or questions from like our internal AI teams, like, hey, have you tried like this model? Can you like take an hour and try to work with model A and then work with model B and tell us what's the differences, what works better? But for the most part, I'll either use like GPT-5 or I'll use Claude Sonnet locally. And I find
Okay.
it sometimes like it just kind of goes back and forth which one's giving me better results for the day.
I ask a lot of people this, and those two seem to be mentioned over and over again. I mean, there's a whole longer list now, ones that you can choose, but those two right there tend to get the most mentions. So I'm always curious to see. And unless GitHub's changed it, we can't select the Copilot coding agent. We can't select the model. It's just kind of selected under the covers. Is that still the case?
I believe so. I have not. I believe that is the case. I haven't tried to change the model anytime recently
Yeah.
on
And I
the.
think I saw documentation that mentioned that it was GPT-5 codecs at the moment. But yeah, I don't see any setting where you could select it. Well, one thing I encounter with the Copilot coding agent is the reality that for teams that are running Windows locally, but then you assign something to the CCA, it's doing all that work on a Linux VM, whereas locally we're doing it on Windows. And that forced, several teams, it forced the teams to recognize maybe there was like one line or something very small left that was still a Windows dependency in the software, in a build script, in a test somewhere, where in order to unlock that Copilot coding agent, it all had to be Linux compatible.
Yeah. Oh, and that's another reason you talk about when to use the browser, when to use local. We still have in our ecosystem, we still have even and Rosyln and many other repos that I kind of like report through me now. We do have some like Windows specific testing. We do have a bit of oftentimes like framework specific testing. And those obviously you can't run them on Linux. Like it's not going
Yeah.
to give you much bang for your buck. And so those are times where when I'm working in, I need to go to make some very Windows specific changes. I might do the model locally to work on that. What's also another like, talk about forcing functions is if you look at the set of tests the compiler can run, a good chunk of those can run on Linux if we
Yeah.
took the
Right.
time to fix them. But historically, a good chunk of them were written on Windows and had some Windows isms in them. And when we moved to GitHub and moved to open source, we did a work to port a huge representative chunk of them to Linux, and they run now, and it's fine. But now, as people are using more AI and it's more the coding agent is on Linux, there was one of the guys on my team was like, I wonder if I can get the agent to go and mass port a bunch of our Windows only tests. Can we get them onto Linux so we can get more coverage like running
Right.
in these scenarios? And so
Yes.
and that is still kind of one of the ongoing things that we have is like can we like move that needle further over to Linux so that we can get a lot more coverage in the agent scenarios.
Nice. Nice. Well, as we close up here, and it's almost Christmas time, but as we go into 20, what tends to be top of mind for you over the coming months?
We have a couple things going on. So we just released .NET 10 and Visual Studio 2026. Whenever you do big major versions like that, you always have random important bugs that are blocking customers. And so we are kind of getting towards the end of that now, and feeling good at that. But now we're starting to pivot and look towards like what does .NET 11 look like? What does the next few iterations of 2026 look like? Some of the things we are looking to kind of adjust with is Visual Studio 2026 has a very different shipping model than the previous versions of Visual Studio. In the past, you could basically, if you wanted to install, you can install probably up to like 4 different versions of Visual
Mm-hmm.
Studio 2022 on your machine because we had various LTS and STS versions, and it shipped it shipped at a pretty predictable quarterly cycle. And our entire product, if you look at how the .NET SDK is written, it ships quarterly, lines up nicely with Visual Studio
Yep.
shipping and makes it a nice synergy. Well, Visual Studio now ships monthly,
Yeah.
and we don't have this long-term support thing. And so we are spending a lot of time figuring out like how do we fit into that new model. And like we're going to keep the .NET SDK as running quarterly, but we have to fit into the fact, well, Visual Studio is shipping monthly now. How do we like get our insertions timed into this system? And then how do we kind of communicate with customers about it? Because one of the things that we're overall, I think like the Visual Studio monthly model is fantastic. It's going to solve a lot of problems for us. It moves the platform forward faster. It makes it so we can get code changed out to customers faster. 99% goodness. One of the downsides, though, is we used to have 3-month long previews in Visual Studio. And so if we had, let's say, a risky change in the compiler or one we were a little uncertain at, we would check it into day 1 of a preview. And we have 3 months of feedback from customers on, is this a good change? Is this a bad change? How is this working? That window is now about 3 weeks instead of 3 months. And so we're like,
Mm.
we're trying to look at how can we find ways to give customers changes where we just kind of don't know if we should do A or we should do B, and we need to get feedback from customers to push us in the right direction. And so we're trying to look to find ways to adapt that old way of solving problems into the like new Visual Studio model. So that's one big thing we're looking at. The other things
Awesome.
are and the other things that are kind of top of mind, like I said, is looking forward to like we're still trying to outline what are the big rocks going to be for .NET 11. We'll almost certainly do some amount of perf work. We're going to be doing discriminated unions for sure. And so that's something that's very top of mind is getting that out early to customers to get feedback on the model we chose to see how they like it. In terms of .NET SDK, we're looking at a lot of one of the things we're looking at is how big is it and how can we optimize the size of the SDK, particularly because that ends up impacting CI times, like how long does it take to download, how long does it take to unzip, and
Mm-hmm.
that how big are your containers are a very popular way for people to write CI on top of .NET. That ends up impacting container size. That's your Azure cost, that's your time. And so we were just even today looking at there's a lot of files that we have duplicated in the SDK. How can we remove that duplication, get the SDK smaller? At the same time, we're going to try and make the SDK bigger by looking at using native AOT in a few
Okay.
places because we
Nice.
want to take there are a number of little .NET command scenarios where we're like, if we could just move that to native AOT, we could make a huge impact in the ecosystem.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
Well,
I was going to say the last. Oh,
yeah.
one more.
Yeah. Yeah. Get it.
The one of the things we did in .NET 10 is we shipped this thing called file-based applications.
Yes.
And, and that is something that we've been dreaming of for 5 years about how to do this. In .NET 10, we finally did it. And what a file-based application is it's just, there's no project file. It is
Mm-hmm.
literally, you just have C# code, you do .NET run a C# file, and it will execute it as is very similar to how you have a project file, but it's independent of it. And that is something we were really looking for that as both a way to kind of lower the bar to entry to .NET. Like it's removing one more piece of ceremony from your Hello World sample. There's no more project file. Hello World in .NET is now console write line Hello World,
Mm-hmm.
.NET run, and you are off and running. And we also expanded that to also, you can now say like you can have package references in the file. You can do like hash colon package, put it there, and we will then incorporate NuGet packages into it. And that's something we shipped in .NET 10, and we've gotten a lot of positive feedback on it. But we want to see how far we can take that. Right now it's limited to a single file. All your code must
Mm-hmm.
be in one file. .NET run it. We want to see people are already pushing on us like, how can I have utility files that are
Yeah.
shared between all of these little apps that I am running?
Right.
And we were we were pretty sure this was going to be a win for people in infrastructure because it was a very convenient way to write programs as single files. Because when we went to customers and look at them, they often have a scripts directory, which is a whole bunch of, either .cmd files or maybe some PowerShell scripts. And it's like, how can we let you transition from that into using C# more in your life? And one of the AI tie-ins was we actually got some feedback from the Bing team. The Bing team found that we were doing this and rather aggressively moved all of their scripts over to file-based applications. And I was kind of like, what? And I was like, why are you? I was like, yay! I love that you're using the things we write. That's fantastic. But like, kind of like, what was your motivation? And one of the things they talked about, they had gotten so used to using AI in their daily workflow to write stuff. They told me they're like, AI is much better at writing C# for what we do than it is for writing PowerShell or Bash. So
Yes.
if we move to using C# over here, like we can just keep feeding into that loop and it will write this stuff for us. And they had some very awesome like file-based apps for how they were looking at Azure DevOps and grabbing data to basically move to make it so they can have local repros of bugs instead of pulling
Nice.
all this data from. So it
Nice.
was really great to hear that from them. So we're looking
Yeah.
at how we can evolve that and the editing experience in VS Code around that.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, Jared, thanks for coming back on the podcast and catching us up for what's going on the C# and SDK team. This is awesome. Thanks so much.
Awesome. Thanks so much for having me.
My pleasure. My pleasure. And until next time, dear listener, keep shipping.